Hey everybody, Josh Mabe, NASCAR Minute. We got Bob Varsha. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Josh. Thank you.
No problem. Tell me this year, what sports are you going to be covering this year?
Well, my job with Fox Sports will take me to the 4 Barrett-Jackson auctions of the year. Of course, one of those in Scottsdale, Arizona has already happened. The next one will be in April in Palm Beach, Florida. I'm also covering the IMSA Series, the Tudor United Sports Car Championship, and the Continental Tire Series. I'm doing the MotoGP World Championship, and I'm doing 3 IndyCar weekends for NBC Sports, including Indianapolis, Pocono, and Toronto.
So, are you mainly with Fox or NBC right now?
I'm mainly with Fox, yes, but I'm not exclusive with them, so I occasionally work on some other networks, but my basic contract is with Fox Sports.
Okay. So, we're going to talk about the different series today. F1. Who's your pick for F1? Obviously, Vettel's really strong. Who's your pick for the F1 championship?
Well, it's a very difficult choice this year, Josh, because as you may know, there's a radical new set of rules, and the teams through 3 attempts at preseason qualifying have struggled largely with the new V6 turbo engines and their strong hybrid accessory. But right now, I think based on preseason testing, you'd have to go with a Mercedes driver, and so just picking blindly, I'm going to take Nico Rosberg, because I think he's probably due. Mercedes has looked relatively strong in testing. They appear to have these new technologies under control in a way that others don't. Surprisingly, the defending champions from Red Bull have struggled mightily, partly due to shortcomings in their design and partly due to the problems that all of the Renault-powered teams are having. So I think this is likely to be the end of Sebastian Vettel's run as a 4-time world champion, and we'll see someone else on the top of the points, and so I'll take Nico Rosberg.
So that's a good pick. Nico Rosberg sure has been doing well in the last couple seasons. All right, IndyCar. The powerhouse teams still remain Ganassi and Penske, but each of them have a new driver, Tony Kanaan and Juan Pablo Montoya. So, and obviously Dario Franchitti's out. So is that going to change? Do you think that's going to change how they have their program?
Well, I think it might. Normally I would go with Scott Dixon as the champion this year, but with Ganassi changing from Honda to Chevrolet Power, there's going to be a certain adjustment there. And with, as you mentioned, Dario Franchitti gone, that removes a very experienced hand. They replaced him with his friend Tony Kanaan, who of course is the reigning Indy 500 winner and a very good driver. But Dario is the kind of personality, both on and off the track, that I think helps unite a team. And I think they will miss his influence, even though he says he will be there for most of the races. I think there's going to be an adjustment period in terms of driver-engineer chemistry and getting to know the Chevrolet engine. So in addition to the other power team you mentioned, besides Ganassi, there is Penske, who have added Juan Pablo Montoya to run alongside their previous 2 incumbents. And I think you have to throw the Andretti team into that equation as well. Andretti is a very well-funded team. They are able to throw a lot of stuff at the wall, if you like, to see what sticks. So I think there's probably a good 10 drivers out there that you have to look at for the championship. Forced to pick one, I think I'll go with Will Power at the Penske team this year. I think he is due. He's been runner-up or close to the championship for several years now, and I think this may be his year.
Who do you think's going to win the Indy 500?
Well, that's another interesting situation. You've got some great stories coming up with the return of Jacques Villeneuve, Busch trying to do the double. But I don't think either of those guys will be a factor. Villeneuve hasn't raced these cars in so long, and Busch has never raced them at all. I've often said that if you want to win the Le Mans 24 Hours, you go find Reinhold Jost. If you want to win the Rolex 24 at Daytona, you find Kevin Butler. And I think if you want to win the Indianapolis 500, the guy you've got to talk to is Roger Penske. So I won't pick one driver, but I think a Penske driver will probably give Roger his, 16th different
something like that
500 victory this year.
So you said you were covering MotoGP. Ryan Villopoto, obviously, good one. Who do you think's going to be a good MotoGP driver this year?
The MotoGP MotoGP champion this year?
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be a great fight. There are new rules in MotoGP as well. Some of the factory teams have opted for the new open class, which gives them a certain advantage in the amount of fuel they carry and the number of tires and engines they can use, both on a race weekend and during the season. But I think the factories are where the action is. Marc Marquez, the reigning champion, youngest MotoGP champion ever, broke his leg in preseason testing, so we can't be too sure how strong he'll be when he gets back in the saddle. And even when he's there, he has a tremendous fight with his Honda teammate Danny Pedrosa and the former world champ Jorge Lorenzo with the Yamaha team. But I think Marquez is young enough to recover quickly, and he is always quick on the bike, whether he's been riding it recently or not. So I'll predict Marc Marquez to repeat as champion.
So what do you think about the Le Mans series?
The Le Mans series, you mean the Tudor United Sports Car Series?
Yeah, yeah,
right. I think they've had a difficult gestation, but their one and only race they've run thus far, the Rolex 24 at Daytona, was a good affair. They're struggling, as sports car racing always has, with the idea of equalizing the performance of a variety of different mechanical setups. You've got 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 cylinder engines in every field. You've got normally aspirated and turbocharged cars, gas powered and diesel powered. So when you take all these different car types, both aerodynamically and mechanically, and try to equalize them, it's very difficult, and you're never going to please everybody. But even though they were a little late getting started, and there was some frustration among the teams, I think if everybody is patient, it's going to be a terrific series down the road.
All right, so Barrett Jackson, that's always a fun thing to watch.
Thank you.
I always enjoy watching you on Fox Sports 1 and that stuff. And so, what is the highest the car has ever gone for on the Barrett Jackson?
The highest price we've ever seen? Well, we've seen a couple of $4 million sales, and they're usually very unusual cars. Just last year, for example, we saw the original TV Batmobile go for $4 million. And half a decade or so before that, we saw a very original GM Futureliner Art Deco bus sold for about $4 million. The only thing to top that was a Carroll Shelby Super Snake, a one-of-one supercharged Cobra that brought, I think the number was around $7 million. So occasionally we hit for big numbers, but the beauty of Barrett Jackson is not so much the big numbers, but the sheer variety of cars and the rock and roll nature of the show. You know, high-end car auctions are often very exclusive affairs, very quiet, very subdued, very elegant. But Barrett Jackson is a real three-ring circus, and I love it for that. The spectators are allowed total access to the facility. You don't have to be a high-end bidder or consignor to get access to all the cars. It's a real good place to go. Well, Brock Yates once called it the greatest car show on earth, and I think that's exactly what it is, where anybody can pay the cost of a general admission and ticket and go on in there and, pretend to be a high roller and find a car that you love or would love to own and imagine buying it. And oftentimes, it's not so difficult to actually acquire a car, because in addition to all those multi-million-dollar cars, there's a lot of cars that sell for less than $15,000 or $20,000, and some of those are pretty sweet rides as well.
So, how many cars do you normally show up to be auctioned off at Barrett Jackson?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question clearly.
How many cars usually are auctioned off at Barrett Jackson?
Well, it varies depending on the auction. For example, the three events we still have to do this year, Palm Beach, Reno, Nevada, and Las Vegas, are 3-day events, either Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The mothership, though, is the Scottsdale auction. That's Barrett Jackson's hometown in Arizona, and that's a 6-day event with all the bells and whistles, and we'll typically have 12 or 1,300 cars crossing the block. The 3-day auctions are a bit more limited, usually in the 400 to 500 car range.
Wow. So, let's talk about NASCAR for a minute. I know occasionally you cover NASCAR, like last year you did a NASCAR race.
Yeah, well, I did a weekend at Atlanta. I didn't actually call the race.
I know, yeah.
But I have been around those guys for a long time, yeah.
So let's talk NASCAR. What do you think of the new chase formats and qualifying formats?
Well, they're going to take some getting used to, but having done Formula One for many years, I'm familiar with that knockout sort of formula in which everybody goes out, and at the end of a predetermined time, you eliminate the slower cars and just let the fast guys get after it. I think it's an idea that holds a lot of promise. I know there was a lot of confusion when they did it for the first time at Phoenix, but they'll get used to it. There's a lot of sharp minds over there. They'll figure out how to turn the process to their advantage. The chase format, well, it's a show, and NASCAR is trying to make it the best show that they can, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have a certain problem, I should say, with drivers being eliminated before you get to the final race. I know the NHRA does a similar thing, their countdown to a championship in the final few national events of the season. But I suppose you could argue that drivers eliminate themselves by poor performance earlier in the season. So, if it generates a little more attention from the sport that we all love, I'm in favor of it. And NASCAR, I think, is still searching for the ideal formula to pick the most eligible dancers in the championship when you get down to the final race of the season. Hopefully they won't go to something as bizarre as Bernie Ecclestone's plan in Formula One to have double points for the last race, because I think that probably crosses the line.
Yeah.
You need a certain consistency, I think, no matter what your form of motorsport, from year to year, not only in the rules, but in the personalities and in the schedule and in the way you score points and win championships. In order for fans to get behind it, I think if you do too much change too often, then people begin to get confused by the whole situation. Now, what are these rules? How are they conducting this? What am I supposed to be looking for? You don't want to make it too much work for the fans to just come out and enjoy themselves. So, if NASCAR thinks that the chase needed a tweak, that's fine, but just be very, very careful, because it's a bit of a high wire act.
So who do you think comes out on top for NASCAR Sprint Cup Series this year? Will it be Jimmy Johnson, or who do you think?
Well, it's you got to bet on the horse that won last before they prove otherwise. Jimmy's not off to the greatest start in the world, but you can see the potential in that 48 team. Let me guess. Kevin Harvick has certainly come out really strongly, and he has slotted into his new team situation at Stewart-Haas pretty well. He might be a pretty good bet as well, but for now, I'll stick with Jimmy until proven wrong.
All right. So do you think that how do you keep up with all these different sports?
Well, it's what I do for a living, so I'm on the computer a lot. I love to read about history generally, and certainly the history of motorsports is fun because it helps fill in my background. And I just kind of look around every day. I'm around motorsports people all the time at Fox Sports, and so there's a lot of cross-pollination, if you will, in terms of stuff people know a great deal about. I get to chat with the guys from the NASCAR crew, my own colleagues in the sports car realm, guys like Dorsey Schrader and Calvin Fish and Tommy Kendall and Justin Bell, and guys like that. I'm really looking forward to coming back to IndyCar this year. I haven't covered those cars in quite a while, although I followed the series. I used to do the kart championship for a bunch of years. So in a way, there'll be a little bit of a homecoming there for me. So I'm really looking forward to that. When you're enthusiastic about what you do, as the saying goes, you never work a day in your life.
So are you going to be working with, do you miss working with Steve Matchett and David Hobbs in F1?
Sure. I miss it even more than I thought I would. I really enjoyed F1. I left it a couple of times in my career, but always came back to it. This time it wasn't my choice. But I do miss it. David I've been working with on and off for the better part of 30 years, and he's like a brother to me. Steve is one of the most fascinating people I know, and it's hard to believe we spent a decade together sharing that announce booth. And although we've gone through several pit reporters over the years, Will Buxton brings a new energy, a more youthful energy to the team, whether I'm there or not. I think Will is a big addition. He is a true citizen of the world. He's on a plane every week, sometimes several times a week, and he seems to have no problem traveling all over the world. Jet lag is something that never seems to knock him up. In fact, if I couldn't do what I'm doing, I'd like to do what Will does and fly all over the world and cover the races. And Fox Sports. The Formula One series that travels the world is called from an announce booth here in the United States. So we don't travel as much as we used to, but it's just part of the situation in the sport right now economically.
So who are you going to be working with for the IndyCar stuff?
Well, these teams shuffle around a little bit. For example, I'll be working with Townsend Bell. Townsend is still an active driver, so sometimes it's available and sometimes he's not, depending on whether he's got a ride. But the collection of guys there on the NBC side include Wally Dallenbach Jr., Townsend, Jan Bikus, and I'm not sure all of the jobs have been nailed down yet. I'm looking forward to a week from Monday when they'll be testing down at Arbor Motorsports Park near my home here in Atlanta, Georgia. And looking forward to meeting the rest of the team and seeing all the IndyCar teams testing. And hopefully something definitive by then. We'll all know who's going to be on the broadcast crew.
All right, so my final question for you today. You said you did F1 for a while for Fox Sports and NBC. For the Texas race, the United States race, did you actually go to that race, or was that also in the studio?
Well, when we did it, the one time we did it for Speed, as it was then known, we did it from the studio. At that point, it had already been announced that NBC was going to take over the rights. So I think our management decided that we would save some money by not broadcasting from site, which is a very expensive proposition. And so we spent our time back in the studio in Charlotte, North Carolina, although we did go to Austin for a few days in the week leading up to the race. Believe it or not, we do the 24 hours of Le Mans the same way. We go over to France for about 4 or 5 days leading up to the race. Then we fly back to Charlotte, North Carolina to call the race from the studio, which is an interesting way to go about our business. But when I began covering Formula One back in the early 1980s, or early 1990s, I should say, we actually traveled to all the races. David Hobbs and I, along with our pit reporter at the time, John Visigliano, we would actually be at the races, something that very few other networks around the world did. And as time went by, we gradually began pulling out of one race or another just for the economic savings. And in the end, we still went to Monaco, but very few other races. And then, of course, 9/11 came along, and the nature of international travel changed entirely. And by that point, we really didn't go to any races. So I'm glad to see that NBC has at least picked up the gauntlet. We have a race here in the United States they go to. We may have another one in the near future. Hopefully they'll go to both, as well as nearby races like Canada. And they've been going to Monaco, which I'm glad to see as well.
All right, thanks, Bob, for joining us.
My pleasure, Josh. Anytime.
All right. That's Bob Varsha, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Bob. You too.